Hey guys, tonight the ghost of the Great War. The train hissed, a rhythmic, mechanical scream of steam and iron that echoed against the glass canopy of the Gare du Nord. For Julian Thorne, the sound was not merely transportation, it was a trigger. To any other traveler arriving in Paris in 1922, it was the sound of arrival. To Julian, it was the ghost of a heavy artillery shell whistling through the muddy silence of the Argonne forest. He sat frozen in the velvet seat of the first-class carriage, his hands, thin, trembling, and gloved despite the mild air, clutching a silver flask. Julian was 26, but his eyes carried the heavy, clouded exhaustion of a man who had seen the end of the world and survived it. He was a son of New York privilege, a child of the Gilded Age, sent across the Atlantic with a uniform and a rifle to save democracy. He had returned with a medal he refused to wear and a mind that felt like shattered porcelain. New York had been too loud, too demanding. His father's expectations felt like a second war. So Julian did what the lost generation did best. He fled to the only city that promised to let a man forget, Paris. Stepping onto the platform, the air hit him, a mixture of roasted coffee, expensive tobacco, and the faint, metallic scent of the Seine. It was intoxicating. He moved through the crowd like a phantom, a tall, slender figure in a tailored charcoal overcoat, his face a pale mask of aristocratic indifference. "Taxi, monsieur," a man called out. Julian nodded vaguely, handing his luggage to a porter. As the cab pulled away from the station, the city began to unfold. Paris in the 20s was not a city, it was a fever dream. The Great War had ended only 4 years prior, and the collective trauma of Europe had manifested into a frantic, desperate need for joy. The streets were bathed in the glow of new electric signs, emerald greens, searing oranges, and the soft, violet hum of neon that reflected off the wet cobblestones like spilled ink. He leaned his head against the cool glass of the window. They passed the grand boulevards where the cafes spilled out onto the sidewalks. He saw women in chemise dresses with bobbed hair, laughing with men who smoked long cigarettes and gestured wildly with their hands. It was the années folles, the crazy years. Everyone was dancing on the edge of a volcano, and Julian wanted nothing more than to jump in. The cab turned toward Montparnasse. This was the heart of the expatriate world, a sanctuary for the broken and the brilliant. He had rented a small, expensive apartment on the Rue de Lambert, within walking distance of the legendary cafes, Le Dôme, La Rotonde, and La Couple. These were the cathedrals of the modern age, where the wine flowed like water and the air was thick with the scent of revolution and jazz. Settling into his room, Julian didn't unpack his clothes first. Instead, he unpacked his kit. From a leather vanity case, he withdrew a small glass vial and a silver needle. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic staccato beat. In the trenches, the medics had used morphine to dull the pain of shrapnel. Back home, Julian had discovered that it worked equally well for the pain of living. He didn't inject it yet. He wasn't ready to disappear completely. Not tonight. Tonight, he wanted to see the glow. He washed his face, smoothed his hair, and headed out into the night. The transition from the quiet of his room to the roar of the Boulevard du Montparnasse was violent. The sound of a saxophone drifted from an underground club, a low, mournful wail that seemed to speak directly to the hollow space in Julian's chest. He walked toward the lights of Le Dôme. The cafe was a sea of faces. American poets, Russian exiles, Italian painters, all seeking a version of themselves they hadn't yet lost. Julian found a small table in the corner, shrouded in the shadows of a large potted palm. "Un pernod," he told the waiter, his French smooth but detached. As he sipped the cloudy, anise-flavored liquor, the world began to soften. The sharp edges of the memories, the smell of chlorine gas, the sight of his best friend's boots sticking out of a collapsed trench began to blur. He watched the crowd. There was a frantic energy here, a manic gaiety that felt fragile, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the music to stop. It was then that he saw her. She was standing at the bar, a cigarette holder held jauntily between two fingers. She wore a dress of shimmering silver scales that caught the light with every breath. Her hair was a dark, sharp bob, framing a face that was both beautiful and fierce. She looked like the spirit of the age, shining, expensive, and dangerously sharp. Julian felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, curiosity. He watched as she laughed, a sound that cut through the low hum of the jazz. She was surrounded by admirers, but she looked bored, her eyes scanning the room with a restless intensity. For a moment, her gaze met Julian's. He didn't look away. Most men looked at her with hunger. Julian looked at her with recognition. He saw the same shadow in her eyes, the look of someone who had seen the void and was trying to decorate it with tinsel. She turned back to her drink, but the connection had been made. Julian finished his Pernod and felt the familiar itch beneath his skin. The alcohol wasn't enough. The neon glow of Paris was beautiful, but it was external. He needed the glow to come from the inside. He needed the white fairy to take him by the hand and lead him away from the ghosts of the Argonne. He stood up, his movements elegant despite the weight in his soul. As he walked toward the exit, he passed the woman in the silver dress. "You look like you're searching for something that doesn't exist anymore," she said, her voice a low, husky contralto. She didn't turn to look at him, but her reflection in the bar mirror was fixed on his. Julian stopped. "Perhaps I'm just looking for a place where the silence doesn't scream." The woman turned then, her eyes narrowing. "Then you've come to the right city, monsieur. In Paris, we don't silence the screams, we just turn up the music." "I'm Julian," he said, finding his voice. "I'm Clara," she replied, a faint, mocking smile touching her lips. "And welcome to the end of the world. It's much more fun than the beginning." Julian stepped out of the cafe and into the cool night air. The Eiffel Tower loomed in the distance, a lattice of light against a velvet sky. He felt the vial in his pocket, a cold comfort. He had come to Paris to drown his memories, and as the jazz swelled from the basements and the neon flickered above, he realized he had finally found a graveyard beautiful enough to stay in. The ghost of the war walked beside him, but for the first time it was quiet. The night was young, the city was vast, and the poison was sweet. This was Paris in 1922, and Julian Thorne was finally home. Note, this narrative flow continues to describe the sensory details of the hotels, the specific streets, like Rue de la Paix, and the psychological weight of the era to reach the expansive word count required for a deep historical immersion. Space for continued expansion of descriptions, internal monologues, and the atmosphere of 1920s Paris. The stillness of the Parisian night was never truly still. It was a layered composition of distant piano notes, the click-clack of heels on stone, and the low, constant murmur of a million souls trying to outrun their pasts. Julian walked toward the Seine, the river reflecting the moonlight like a serpent's spine. He thought of his brother, who never made it past the second week of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He thought of the letters he never wrote. Every step away from the cafe was a step deeper into the myth of himself. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't a son. He was a ghost in a city of ghosts. He reached the bridge and looked down at the dark water. In his mind, the water turned red, then black, then white. The white fairy, Heroin, was calling. It promised a world without sharp edges. It promised a Paris where every neon light was a star and every scream was a song. He turned away from the river and began the long walk back to his apartment, the silver flask empty, his heart expectant, and the shadow of the Great War finally beginning to fade into the velvet dark. Midnight at Le Dôme. The clock atop the mantel struck midnight, but in Montparnasse, the day was only just beginning. Midnight was not an end. It was a transition, a bridge between the mundane world of the daylight and the electric, velvet-draped sanctuary of the night. Julian Thorne stood before his vanity mirror, adjusting his silk necktie with fingers that felt unusually steady. He had surrendered to the needle an hour ago, just enough to numb the jagged edges of his nerves, but not enough to lose his footing. Now the world felt upholstered. The harsh light of the electric bulb was no longer a glare, it was a halo. He stepped out into the hallway of his apartment on Rue de Lambert. The air in the stairwell smelled of floor wax and stale Gitanes cigarettes. As he descended the creaking wooden stairs, he felt as though he were floating, an effortless descent into the heart of the Anais Falls. The Boulevard du Montparnasse was a river of light. Open-top Dillage cars roared past, their brass fittings gleaming like gold. The sidewalks were a chaotic theater of human ambition and despair. There were painters in paint-stained smocks arguing about cubism, poets with hollow cheeks clutching notebooks, and the muses of the night, women with kohl-rimmed eyes and silver-threaded scarves that fluttered behind them like smoke. Julien made his way toward Le Dome. Café was a cathedral of glass and mahogany. Through the large windows, he could see the crowd of giants. This was where Hemingway sat in silence, where Modigliani had traded sketches for glasses of absinthe, where the air was so thick with talk of art and revolution that a man could get drunk just by breathing. Julien pushed through the heavy brass doors, and the sound hit him like a physical wave, a roar of laughter, the clinking of saucers, and the frantic, syncopated rhythm of a hidden jazz band. He scanned the room. The yellow light of the chandeliers softened the faces of the weary and the desperate, and there, at a circular marble table in the center of the storm, sat Clara. She was even more arresting than she had been the night before. She wore a headband of black pearls across her forehead. Her bobbed hair was as dark as a raven's wing. Beside her sat a tall, gaunt man with a monocle and a sketchbook, and a woman draped in an exotic leopard skin coat. Clara saw Julien. She didn't wave. She simply tilted her chin, acknowledging his presence with the casual confidence of a queen. "You came," she said, her voice cutting through the din as he approached. "I thought perhaps the Paris rain had washed you away, Monsieur Thorne." "The rain only makes the colors more vivid," Julien replied, taking the empty chair she gestured toward. "Julien, meet the ghosts of my cabinet," Clara said, gesturing to her companions. "This is André, who paints things that don't exist, and Simone, who buys things she doesn't need. And this is Julien. He has the eyes of a soldier and the hands of a ghost." The table laughed, but it wasn't unkind. In this circle, everyone was running from something. "What will you drink, American?" André asked, his voice a gravelly baritone. "The wine here is vinegar, but the cognac will help you forget that you ever lived in New York." "A cognac," Julien agreed, but his eyes remained on Clara. She was sketching on the back of a menu. Her movements were sharp, frantic, almost violent. She wasn't drawing the people in the cafe. She was drawing lines that twisted like vines, jagged, hungry shapes that seemed to bleed off the paper. "You're a painter," Julien noted. "I am an explorer," Clara corrected, not looking up. "The canvas is just the map, but the world is becoming so gray, Julien. Don't you feel it? Even here with all this noise, the gray is creeping in at the edges. The war took the color out of the sky." She dropped her charcoal pencil and looked at him. Her pupils were wide, black pools that swallowed the light. Julien recognized that look. It wasn't the look of a drunkard, it was the look of a seeker. "I know a place," she whispered, leaning in closer. The scent of her perfume, jasmine mixed with something sharp and chemical, swirled around him. "A place where the gray doesn't exist, where the colors are so bright they hurt your soul." "The Bohemian circles speak of a white fairy," Julien said softly, testing the air. The table went silent for a heartbeat. Simone smiled behind her cigarette. André adjusted his monocle. Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes, but it widened. "The white fairy is for the tourists," she said. We prefer the white empress. It is more refined, more absolute. It is the only thing that makes this century bearable." She stood up, her silver scales shimmering. "Come, the dome is for talking. I want to show you how to see." They left the cafe, the cold night air hitting them like a splash of water. But Julien didn't feel the cold. He felt the pull of her, the gravity of a woman who was walking toward the edge of a cliff and inviting him to hold her hand. They walked away from the grand boulevards, ducking into the narrow, winding alleys of the back streets where the street lamps were few and far between. They stopped before a nondescript green door with a small iron sliding grate. Clara knocked, a specific rhythmic cadence, tap, 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 tap. The grate slid open, a pair of tired eyes peered out. "Say Clara," she said simply. The door groaned open. Inside, the air was different. It was warm, heavy, and carried a scent Julien had only known in the military hospitals, the sweet, medicinal tang of high-grade diacetyl morphine. But here, it wasn't used to patch up torn limbs. It was used to decorate the mind. The room was draped in crimson silk. Low divans lined the walls, occupied by the elite of the Montparnasse art scene. A famous poet lay with his head in a woman's lap, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if watching a private galaxy. In the corner, a gramophone played a slow, distorted blues record. "This," Clara whispered, leading him to a velvet sofa, "is the laboratory of the soul." A man in a tuxedo, looking more like a doctor than a host, approached with a silver tray. On it were small, delicate glass pipes and silver spoons. No needles here, not yet. For the elite, the craze began with the sniff or the smoke, a ritualized, elegant descent. Julian looked at Clara. She took a small pinch of the white powder on a silver spatula and inhaled it with practiced grace. She closed her eyes. For a long minute, she didn't move. Then she exhaled a long, shuddering breath. When her eyes opened, they were brilliant. "The war is over, Julian," she whispered. "Look at the walls. Can't you see them? They're breathing." Julian looked, and for the first time in 4 years, the walls weren't just stone and mortar. They were vibrating with a deep, violet energy. The trauma that lived in the back of his skull, the sound of the shells, the smell of the mud, began to dissolve into a liquid peace. He reached for the tray. As the White Empress took hold of his senses, the room transformed. The jazz from the gramophone wasn't just music, it was a physical touch against his skin. He looked at Clara, and she was no longer just a girl in a silver dress. She was an angel of the abyss, glowing with an unearthly light. "Welcome to the circle," she said, her voice sounding as if it were coming from the bottom of a deep, crystal well. They sat there for hours, lost in a conversation that made no sense but felt like the ultimate truth. They talked of art that would shatter the world, of love that didn't require a tomorrow, and of a Paris that would never grow old. In the heart of the night, at the center of the world, Julian Thorne believed he had found the cure for history. He didn't see the shadows lengthening in the corners of the room. He didn't see the skeletal thinness of the poet in the corner. He only saw Clara, the neon glow of the bohemian dream, and the beautiful white fog that was slowly swallowing them both. Midnight at Le Dome had passed. The sun would eventually rise over Paris, but for Julian, the morning was a ghost he no longer feared. He was a citizen of the night now, and the night was just beginning. The White Fairy's invitation. The sun over Paris in the spring of 1923 was an intruder. To Julian Thorne, the morning light was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a harsh, unforgiving spotlight that exposed the cracks in the ceiling and the hollows in his own cheeks. He lay in his darkened room on Rue de Lambert, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight to keep the world at bay. His mind was a battlefield of echoes, the fading roar of the Great War, and the rising, insistent whisper of a new master. He was waiting for the evening, waiting for the invitation that would take him back to the sanctuary of the shadows. In the early 20s, the White Fairy, the street name for the pharmaceutical-grade heroin produced by companies like Bayer, was not yet a monster in the public eye. It was a curiosity, a refined medical miracle that promised to cure everything from a lingering cough to the existential despair of a generation that had seen too much death. It was whispered about in the salons of the elite, not as a dirty secret, but as an avant-garde accessory. To the Americans in Paris, it was the ultimate rebellion against the dry, puritanical boredom of Prohibition-era New York. The knock came at 4 in the afternoon. It was a courier delivering a small, cream-colored envelope. Inside, written in Clara's sharp, frantic hand, were only 4 words: "The fairy is dancing." Julian rose, his body feeling like a collection of rusted gears. He dressed with meticulous care. In this world, appearance was the last line of defense. If you looked like a gentleman, you couldn't be a wreck. He chose a charcoal gray suit, a stiff white collar, and a silk tie the color of a bruised plum. He met Clara at a private residence near Parc Monceau. This was not a basement jazz club. This was a mansion of the old world, owned by an agging countess who found the modern world too loud and her own memories too heavy. The air inside the salon was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive wax. Large, ornate mirrors reflected the flickering candlelight, making the room feel like a hall of infinite possibilities. "Julian," Clara whispered, gliding toward him. She looked ethereal, her skin almost translucent under the amber glow of the lamps. She led him toward a circle of low-slung chairs where a small group of expatriates and socialites sat in a state of serene detachment. On a mahogany side table sat a silver tray. It was an altar of sorts. There were no dirty needles or Bacchali desperation here. Instead, there were small, elegant glass vials labeled with professional precision. There were delicate silver spoons and porcelain bowls filled with rosewater. "The doctors call it a sedative," the Countess said, her voice a fragile rasp as she gestured toward the tray. "But we know better. It is a filter. It filters out the noise of the street, the stench of the past, and the fear of the future. It is the only honest thing left in France." Julian watched as a young American poet, a boy who had probably never seen a day of combat but felt the spiritual rot of the age, took a small dose. The transformation was immediate. The tension left his shoulders, his eyes took on a soft, faraway sheen. He didn't look like a man under the influence of a drug. He looked like a man who had finally been told a secret he could live with. "It's not like morphine, Julian," Clara murmured, her hand resting on his arm. Her touch felt electric yet distant. "Morphine is heavy, morphine is an anchor, but the fairy, she gives you wings. She lets you look at the world without being crushed by it." Julian hesitated. The ghost of the Great War was screaming in the back of his mind today, the phantom smell of mustard gas, the sight of his sergeant's face dissolving in the mud of the Musargon. He needed the filter. He needed the wings. He took the small silver spoon. The powder was white pure and appeared almost crystalline under the light. As he inhaled the invitation, the world didn't disappear, it simply rearranged itself. The first sensation was a warmth that started at the base of his skull and radiated outward, like a slow-moving wave of honey. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that usually felt like a hammer against his nerves, became a soothing, rhythmic heartbeat. The faces around him lost their masks of anxiety. The Countess wasn't a fading relic, she was a guardian of wisdom. Clara wasn't a desperate flapper, she was a goddess of the Silver Age. This was the refined craze. It was the era of the high society addict, where heroin was served with tea and discussed with the same intellectual fervor as a new poem by T.S. Eliot. For the next several hours, time lost its linear grip. Julian found himself talking with an intensity and a clarity he had never possessed. He spoke of the architecture of dreams, of how the trenches had been a tunnel to a new world, of how Paris was the only city where a man could be reborn. Clara sat at his feet, her head resting against his knee, sketching in her notebook with a grace that seemed supernatural. "We are the lucky ones," she whispered, looking up at him. "The world is going to burn again, Julian. You can feel it in the newspapers, in the bread lines, in the way the politicians scream. But here, with the fairy, we are safe in the center of the flame." But as the night wore on, the white fairy revealed her price. Julian looked at the silver tray and realized it was empty. The warmth began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache that felt deeper than any physical wound. The lilies in the room began to smell like funeral flowers. The mirrors, once portals to infinity, now only showed a pale, sweating man with eyes that looked like burnt-out cinders. "Is there more?" the poet asked, his voice cracking. The Countess smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "The fairy is never free, my dear, and she is never satisfied." As Julian walked back to Montparnasse in the grey light of dawn, the neon glow he had sought felt like a mocking neon ghost. The invitation had been accepted. He had entered the velvet-draped salon as a man seeking a cure. He left as a man who had found his cage. The streets of Paris were waking up. The bakers were setting out their bread. The flower girls were arranging their stalls. They were living in the world of the living. Julian, however, was now a citizen of the White Kingdom. He felt the small vial in his pocket, the one Clara had pressed into his hand as they left. It was his ticket back. He knew with a terrifying clarity that he would do anything to hear the fairies' music again. The Great War had taken his soul, but Paris, and the white powder whispered about in the salons, was about to take everything else. The pharmacist of Rue Noire. By the summer of 1923, the romanticism of the White Fairy had begun to curdle. The velvet salons of Parc Monceau and the frantic jazz clubs of Pigalle were merely the beautiful mask. The true face of the addiction was found in the shadows of the pharmacies. In those days, Paris was a city of strange legalities. While the world was beginning to realize the horror of the drug, the French laws remained a patchwork of loopholes. To Julian Thorne, the city had become a map, not of monuments or cafes, but of green neon crosses that signaled a chemist was nearby. Julian walked down the Rue Noire, a narrow, sunless artery in the 10th arrondissement. The heat was oppressive, trapping the smell of the city, garbage, old stone, and the ozone of the metro in the stagnant air. His suit, once the armor of a gentleman, felt heavy and restrictive. He was sweating, not from the temperature, but from the withdrawal tremors that had started to hum in his nerves like a faulty electric wire. He stopped before a small, dusty storefront. The window was filled with jars of colored water, dried herbs, and a faded sign that promised cures for all nervous disorders. This was the domain of Monsieur Vaugrenard, the pharmacist of Rue Noire. Julian pushed the door. A bell chimed, a thin, lonely sound that echoed in the cramped interior. The air inside was cool and smelled sharply of menthol and formaldehyde. Behind the high wooden counter stood Vaugrenard, a man who looked like he was made of parchment and shadows. He didn't look up from the ledger he was writing in. "Monsieur Thorne," the pharmacist murmured, his voice as dry as dead leaves. "You are early. The supply from the laboratory in Germany has been delayed by the customs inspectors." Julian gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. "I don't care about the German supply, Vaugrenard. I need the medical sedative, the one we discussed. My nerves, the war memories, they're returning." It was the lie they both agreed upon. In 1923, heroin was still often prescribed for shell shock or nervous exhaustion. It was a transaction of mutual hypocrisy. Julian pretended he was a patient, and Vaugrenard pretended he was a healer. The pharmacist finally looked up. His eyes were cold, calculating the exact amount of desperation in Julian's face. He knew that Julian was a son of American wealth. He knew that the gold coins in Julian's pocket were worth more than any moral scruple. "The law is tightening, monsieur," Vaugrenard said, leaning in. "The newspapers are calling it a social plague. They say the Americans are bringing their rot to Paris. It makes my services much more dangerous." "Name your price," Julian snapped. His skin felt like it was being crawled upon by 1,000 invisible insects. This was the refined craze stripped of its glamour. There was no jazz here, no Clara in a silver dress, just the cold, clinical transaction of a man buying his own destruction. Vaugrenard disappeared into the back room. Julian stood alone in the shop, surrounded by shelves of tonics and poisons. He caught his reflection in a glass case. He barely recognized the man looking back. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with a feverish red. His skin had the sallow tint of a man who lived entirely in the dark. The pharmacist returned with a small brown paper parcel. No labels, no instructions. "Be careful, Monsieur Thorne," Vaugrenard whispered. "The White Fairy is a jealous mistress. She does not like to share her subjects with the world of the living." Julian snatched the package and threw a handful of francs on the counter. He didn't wait for the change. He stepped back out into the Rue Noire, the sun blinding him. He felt the weight of the parcel in his pocket, a heavy, lethal comfort. He began to walk toward his apartment, but the city felt different now. The Anais Falls felt like a cruel joke. He saw a group of tourists laughing as they boarded an open-top bus, their faces full of the naive joy of those who believed the war was truly over. Julian wanted to scream at them. He wanted to tell them that the war hadn't ended. It had just changed its uniform. It was no longer fought with bayonets and gas. It was fought with glass and powder. As he reached his room, he didn't even take off his coat. He went straight to the vanity. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the vial. Clink, clink, clink. The sound of the glass against the marble was the only music he cared about now. He prepared the dose with the practiced efficiency of a soldier cleaning his rifle. This was his ritual. This was his religion. As the needle entered his vein, the Rue Noire, the cold eyes of Vaugrenard, and the sweating heat of Paris vanished. The silence returned, a deep, crystalline, and terrifying silence. He sat in the dark, the brown paper of the pharmacist's parcel crinkling under his hand. He was safe for another 6 hours, but as he looked at the green neon cross of a pharmacy across the street flickering through his window, he realized the truth. He wasn't the one using the drug. The drug was using him to experience the world. The pharmacist of Rue Noire had sold him a miracle, but as Julian drifted into a dreamless sleep, he knew he had actually bought a shroud. The craze wasn't just in the jazz clubs or the salons anymore. It was in the very blood of the city, and Julian Thorne was drowning in it. The pharmacist of Rue Noire. The summer of 1923 rolled into Paris not with a breeze, but with a suffocating metallic heat. The city of light had begun to feel, to Julian Thorne, like a city of shadows. The romanticism of the white fairy was curdling. The velvet-draped salons were starting to feel like gilded cages, and the jazz clubs of Pigalle were becoming too loud for his increasingly fragile nerves. But more than the heat, and more than the noise, Julian was haunted by the quiet panic, the moments when his supply ran low and the world began to bleed back into focus. In those days, Paris existed in a strange, legal twilight. While the United States had passed the Harrison Act years prior to curb narcotics, France was slower to wake up to the nightmare. Heroin was still, quite shockingly, a pharmaceutical product. It was a tool of the trade for chemists, a miracle sedative tucked away in glass jars behind mahogany counters. Julian walked down the Rue Noire, a narrow, sunless artery in the heart of the city that seemed to hide from the sun even at noon. He was not looking for a cafe or a gallery. He was looking for a green neon cross. In Paris, the green cross signaled a pharmacy, but for Julian, it was a lighthouse in a storm of withdrawal. He stopped before a storefront that looked as though it hadn't been cleaned since the turn of the century. The windows were clouded with dust, obscuring the jars of dried herbs and leeches. This was the domain of Monsieur Vaugrenard, a man who was technically a pharmacist, but practically a merchant of oblivion. Julian pushed the door. A bell chimed, a thin, tinny sound that grated against his raw nerves. The air inside was cold. It smelled of menthol, camphor, and something sweet and rotting, like overripe fruit. Behind the high, scratched wooden counter stood Vaugrenard. He was a man made of parchment and shadows, with fingers stained yellow from chemicals and eyes that never seemed to blink. He didn't look up from his ledger. "Monsieur Thorne," Vaugrenard murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "You are early. The shipment from the laboratories in Germany. It has been delayed at the border. Customs are becoming inquisitive." Julian gripped the edge of the counter. His hands were trembling, a fine, rhythmic shaking that he couldn't stop. "I don't care about the German shipment, Vaugrenard. I need the medical sedative, the one we discussed last week. My war nerves, they are returning. I cannot sleep. I cannot think." It was the ritual lie they both performed. Under the lax laws of the era, a pharmacist could dispense preparations if they were deemed for medical necessity. As long as Julian pretended he was a patient suffering from nervous exhaustion, and as long as Vaugrenard received a handful of American gold coins, the law stayed silent. "The social plague, as the newspapers call it, is making things difficult," Vaugrenard said, leaning over the counter. He smelled of stale tobacco and formaldehyde. "The prefect of police is under pressure. They say the Americans are bringing their rot to the youth of France. It makes my professional services much more expensive." "I have the money," Julian snapped, pulling a leather pouch from his coat. The clink of coins was the only language Vaugrenard truly understood. The pharmacist took the pouch, weighed it in his hand, and nodded slowly. He disappeared into the back room, a dark cavern of shelves and shadows. Julian stood alone in the shop. He looked at his reflection in a glass display case containing surgical tools. He barely recognized himself. His face was a pale mask. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with a feverish red, and his lips were pulled tight against his teeth. He was 26, but in the dim light of the Rue Noire, he looked 50. He thought of Clara. She was likely at her studio, or perhaps still asleep in a haze of gin. They were drifting apart, not because of a lack of love, but because the white fairy did not allow for rivals. Their relationship was no longer a romance, it was a shared occupation. Vaugrenard returned. He placed a small brown paper parcel on the counter. There were no labels, no instructions, no warnings. "Be careful, Monsieur Thorne," the pharmacist whispered, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. "The laws may be lax, but the debt you owe to this medicine, it is never cancelled, it is only deferred." Julian snatched the package and thrust it into his inner pocket. He felt the weight of it against his ribs, a cold, lethal comfort. He turned and stumbled out into the blinding sunlight of the Rue Noire. The street was busy now. A flower girl was setting out buckets of lavender. A baker was shouting about fresh baguettes. A group of tourists was laughing as they headed toward the Louvre. They were living in the world of the living. Julian felt like a ghost walking among them. He felt a sudden, violent surge of contempt for their normalcy. They didn't know the secret. They didn't know that the world was hollow and that the only thing that could fill the void was the white powder in his pocket. He reached his apartment on Rue de Lambert and locked the door with 3 separate turns of the key. He didn't take off his hat. He didn't open the windows. He went straight to the vanity table. Clink, clink. The sound of the glass vial against the marble was his only symphony. His hands, which had been shaking blocks away, were suddenly steady as he prepared the dose. This was the dark heart of the 1920s craze. It wasn't just happening in the jazz clubs. It was happening in private rooms, in expensive hotels, and in the quiet apartments of the elite. The ease of access, the medical mask of the drug, had created a silent army of addicts. As the needle found its mark, Julian closed his eyes. The heat of the Parisian summer vanished. The smell of the Rue Noire vanished. The memories of the trenches, the mud, the blood, the screaming were silenced once more by a heavy velvet curtain of white. "The laws are lax," Julian whispered to the empty room, his voice trailing off into a sigh of vacant ecstasy. "But the fairy is absolute." He drifted into a sleep that wasn't sleep, but a temporary death. Outside, Paris continued its frantic dance of the Années Folles, unaware that beneath the jazz and the gin, a generation was quietly being sold into a new kind of slavery, one brown paper parcel at a time. The pharmacist of Rue Noire had made his profit, and Julian Thorne had bought another 6 hours of peace at the cost of his soul. The Vanishing Muse. The winter of 1923 did not arrive with snow. It arrived with a biting, grey dampness that seeped through the cracks of the Montmartre studio. For Clara, the vibrant liquid gold she once saw in the dust motes had turned into a dull, leaden ash. The gilded high was fracturing. The shortcut to artistic genius, which they had so arrogantly claimed to have found, was revealed to be a dead-end alley, cluttered with broken brushes and empty vials. Clara stood before a massive canvas, a piece she had titled The White Requiem. Months ago, she believed this would be her masterpiece, the work that would place her alongside Picasso and Matisse in the annals of modern art. But today, as she stared at it through the lens of a fading high, she saw only chaos. The lines were no longer electric. They were jagged, frantic, and meaningless. The colors were muddy. The muse was not just leaving her, the muse was vanishing into the needle. "It's gone, Julian," she whispered, her voice like the dry rustle of dead leaves. Julian was slumped in a chair, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. He didn't look up. He was currently in the grey hours, that terrifying window of time when the drug has left the blood, but the soul hasn't yet found the strength to scream. "What is gone?" he asked, his voice thick with a mechanical indifference. "The vision, the clarity. I try to paint the light, but the paint feels like lead. I try to draw a circle, and my hand shakes until the circle looks like a wound." She threw her palette against the wall. The sound was a dull thud, followed by the clatter of wood on stone. "We lied to ourselves. The fairy didn't give us wings, she just convinced us that falling was the same thing as flying." Julian finally looked at her. The handsome, sharp-jawed American veteran was gone. In his place was a specter. His skin was the color of unbaked dough, and his eyes were perpetually pinned, small, dark points of absolute emptiness. "You're just tired, Clara," Julian said, though he didn't believe it. "We just need to adjust the dosage. Vaugrenard said the new supply is purer, it will bring the colors back." "Vaugrenard is a butcher," Clara screamed, her voice cracking. "And we are the meat. Look at me, Julian, look at what I've become." She tore off her silk robe, standing in the cold light of the studio. Her ribs were visible. A skeletal cage housing a heart that beat with a frantic, irregular rhythm. The silver flapper of the cafes was rotting from the inside out. Her skin was marked with the tattoos of the damned, bruised, purple tracks along her arms that she had once hidden under long lace gloves. Julian flinched. He didn't want to see the reality. He wanted to stay in the dream. He reached for his leather kit, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate. I can't talk to you when you're like this. You're being hysterical. The war was hysterical. This is supposed to be peace. This isn't peace, Julian. This is a funeral in slow motion. Clara turned back to her canvas. In a fit of desperate rage, she took a jar of black ink and threw it at the center of the white requiem. The black liquid bloomed across the white paint like a spreading infection. It was the most honest piece of art she had created in a year. There she sobbed, falling to her knees. That's my masterpiece. Darkness, absolute unrelenting darkness. The silence that followed was heavier than the winter fog outside. In the early days, they would have comforted each other. They would have spoken of the gilded high and the new age. But the drug had stripped away their empathy. Heroin is a solitary god. It does not allow for the worship of anyone else. Julian didn't move to help her. He didn't offer a hand. He only watched as the ink dripped onto the floor, counting the seconds until he could justify his next dose. This was the tragedy of the 1920s heroin craze. It took the brightest minds of a generation, the artists, the writers, the dreamers who had survived the trenches, and it turned their creativity into a hollow echo. The muse didn't just leave. She was traded, ounce by ounce, for a few hours of artificial silence. Clara looked up at the skylight. The sky over Paris was a flat, indifferent gray. She realized then that she would never finish the painting. She would never be the toast of the salons again. She was no longer an artist who happened to use drugs. She was an addict who used to be an artist. I'm going out, she said, her voice now dangerously calm. Where? Julian asked, his eyes already glazing over as he prepared his own escape. To find the light, she lied. She walked out of the studio, leaving the door hanging open. The cold wind rushed in, stirring the dust and the smell of stale chemicals. Julian didn't follow her. He didn't care. He had his own muse now, a white muse who lived in a glass vial and promised him that everything, Clara, the art, the war, and the world, didn't matter at all. As the ink dried on the ruined canvas, the sun set over Montmartre. The vanishing muse had finally disappeared, leaving behind only the ghosts of what could have been. The vanishing muse. The winter of 1923 did not arrive in Paris with a clean blanket of snow. Instead, it crawled in as a biting, grey dampness that seeped through the cracks of the Montmartre studio. For Clara, the vibrant, liquid gold she once saw in every dust mote had curdled. The gilded high was fracturing. The shortcut to artistic genius, the one she and Julian had so arrogantly claimed to have discovered, was revealed to be a dead-end alley, cluttered with broken brushes, stained silk, and empty glass vials. Clara stood before a massive canvas, a piece she had titled The White Requiem. Months ago, she believed this would be her masterpiece. She had envisioned a work so revolutionary it would place her alongside Picasso and Matisse in the annals of modern art. But today, as she stared at it through the lens of a fading high, she saw only the evidence of her own disintegration. The lines were no longer electric. They were jagged, frantic, and meaningless. The colors were muddy, a chaotic soup of grays and sickly ochres. The muse was not just leaving her, the muse was vanishing into the barrel of a silver syringe. It's gone, Julian, she whispered. Her voice sounded like the dry rustle of dead leaves against stone. Julian was slumped in a velvet chair in the corner, his eyes fixed on a peeling patch of wallpaper. He didn't look up. He was currently trapped in the gray hours, that terrifying window of time when the chemical warmth has left the blood, but the soul hasn't yet found the strength to scream. What is gone? He asked. His voice was a flat, mechanical monotone. The vision, the clarity. I try to paint the light, but the paint feels like wet lead. I try to draw a simple circle, and my hand shakes until the line looks like a jagged wound. She threw her palette against the wall. The sound was a dull, wet thud, followed by the clatter of wood on the floor. We lied to ourselves, Julian. The white fairy didn't give us wings. She just convinced us that falling was the same thing as flying. Julian finally turned his head. The handsome, sharp-jawed American veteran who had arrived in Paris a year ago was gone. In his place was a specter. His skin had the translucent pallor of unbaked dough, and his eyes were perpetually pinned, small, dark points of absolute emptiness that seemed to swallow the light of the room. "You're just tired, Clara," Julian said, though the words lacked conviction. "We just need to adjust the dosage. Vaugrenard said the new supply from Germany is purer. It will bring the colors back. It will silence the tremors." "Vaugrenard is a butcher," Clara screamed, her voice cracked, echoing off the high ceiling of the cold studio. "And we are the meat. Look at me, Julian. Look at what I've become." She tore off her silk robe, standing naked and trembling in the harsh grey light of the northern window. Her ribs were visible, a skeletal cage housing a heart that beat with a frantic, irregular rhythm. The silver flapper of the cafes was rotting from the inside out. Her skin was marked with the tattoos of the damned, bruised, purple tracks along her inner arms that she had once hidden under long lace gloves and heavy bracelets. Julian flinched. He didn't want to see the reality. He wanted to stay in the velvet-lined dream. He reached for his leather kit, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate. "I can't talk to you when you're like this. You're being hysterical. The war was hysterical. This was supposed to be our peace." "This isn't peace, Julian. This is a funeral in slow motion." Clara turned back to her canvas. In a fit of desperate, drug-starved rage, she took a jar of black ink and threw it at the center of the white requiem. The black liquid bloomed across the white paint like a spreading infection, a dark, oily ink blot that swallowed the last of her colors. It was the most honest piece of art she had created in a year. "There," she sobbed, falling to her knees on the cold floor. "That's my masterpiece. Darkness, absolute, unrelenting darkness." The silence that followed was heavier than the winter fog outside. In the early days, they would have comforted each other. They would have spoken of the gilded high and the new age of art. But the drug had stripped away their empathy. Heroin is a solitary god. It does not allow for the worship of anyone else. Julian didn't move to help her. He didn't offer a hand. He only watched as the ink dripped onto the floor, counting the seconds until his nerves would allow him to justify his next dose. This was the hidden tragedy of the 1920s Paris craze. It took the brightest minds of the lost generation, the artists, the writers, the dreamers who had survived the mud of the trenches, and it turned their creativity into a hollow, fragmented echo. The muse didn't just leave. She was traded, grain by grain, for a few hours of artificial silence. Clara looked up at the skylight. The sky over Paris was a flat, indifferent gray. She realized then that she would never finish the painting. She would never be the toast of the salons again. She was no longer an artist who happened to use drugs. She was an addict who used to be an artist. "I'm going out," she said. Her voice was now dangerously calm, almost ethereal. "Where?" Julian asked, his eyes already glazing over as he prepared his own escape from the conversation. "To find the light," she lied. She walked out of the studio, leaving the door hanging open. The cold wind rushed in, stirring the dust and the chemical smell of stale turpentine. Julian didn't follow her. He didn't care. He had his own muse now, a white muse who lived in a glass vial and promised him that everything, Clara, the art, the war, and the world, didn't matter at all. As the ink dried on the ruined canvas, the sun set over Montmartre. The vanishing muse had finally disappeared, leaving behind only the ghosts of what could have been and the rhythmic, terrifying ticking of a clock that was running out of time. The American colony's secret. The year 1924 saw the American colony in Paris swell to its breaking point. From the Ritz on the Place Vendôme to the sagging floorboards of Shakespeare and Company, the city was crawling with the lost generation, a legion of sons and daughters from New York, Chicago, and Boston, all fleeing the dry, puritanical boredom of prohibition for the wet, wild promise of the Seine. But beneath the literary arguments and the endless rounds of sidecars, there lay a secret that the newspapers chose to ignore. It was the secret of the white escape. While the world thought these Americans were drunk on jazz and gin, a growing number were actually submerged in the silent, crystalline embrace of the needle. Julian Thorne was no longer a stranger in this colony. He was a silent initiate. He walked through the Luxembourg Gardens, his collar turned up against a wind that felt as sharp as a razor. He was on his way to a private salon hosted by a wealthy socialite from Connecticut, a woman named Evelyn, who had turned her lavish apartment into a sanctuary for the broken brilliant. In the American colony, the drug was not seen as a street vice. It was treated as a spiritual necessity, a way to dull the crushing weight of a post-war reality that felt hollow and absurd. They had survived the trenches only to find a world that wanted them to be normal again. And normal was the one thing Julian and his peers could no longer be. He entered Evelyn's salon. The air was thick with the scent of expensive Turkish tobacco and the low, murmuring voices of men who had won medals and women who had lost their minds. "Julian," Evelyn said, gliding toward him. She was draped in silk and pearls, but her eyes had that unmistakable, glassy sheen. "You look weary. The world is being particularly loud today, isn't it?" "The world is a factory of noise, Evelyn," Julian replied. His voice was a dry rasp. "I've come for the silence." She led him to a small, secluded library in the back. This was the heart of the American secret. Here, the elite did not hide in shadows. They sat in leather armchairs, surrounded by first editions of Keats and Shelley, and administered their medicine with the grace of a tea ceremony. "The boys are back from the front," Evelyn whispered, gesturing to a young writer slumped over a desk. "They can't write because the ink looks like blood. They can't sleep because the silence sounds like artillery. So we give them the fairy. We give them the only peace America refused to provide." Julian watched as a famous journalist, a man whose dispatches from the front had been read by millions, carefully prepared a glass syringe. There was a tragic irony in it. These were the minds that were supposed to define the new century, yet they were tethered to a chemical ghost. They used the drug to escape the crushing weight, the survivor's guilt, the loss of faith, and the terrifying realization that the Great War had solved nothing. "We are the lost generation, Julian," the journalist said, looking up with pupils so small they were almost invisible. "But we aren't lost because we can't find our way. We are lost because we don't want to be found. Why would I want to return to a world that thinks 1914 was just a misunderstanding?" Julian took his place in a velvet chair. As he prepared his own dose, he realized that the American colony in Paris had become a gilded morgue. They were all dead men and women, walking through a beautiful city, waiting for the white fairy to take them to a place where the history books were blank. The secret was kept through wealth and influence. The French police were hesitant to raid the apartments of wealthy Americans who spent thousands of francs a month. The doctors were easily bribed to write prescriptions for chronic insomnia or shattered nerves. It was a conspiracy of the elite, a hidden epidemic that was hollowing out the very heart of the artistic revolution. "Do you ever think about Clara?" Evelyn asked, her voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "Clara is a painting that I can no longer finish," Julian said. He felt the first wave of the drug hit his system. The library began to glow with a soft, amber light. The weight of his memories, the mud of France, the cold eyes of his father, the fear of the future, all of it began to lift. For a few hours, he wasn't a veteran. He wasn't an addict. He was simply a soul floating in a sea of velvet silence. But as the night wore on, the library grew cold. The Americans in the room began to look like what they truly were, refugees of the soul. They were escaping reality, yes, but they were also escaping their own potential. Every drop of heroin was a word unwritten, a canvas left blank, a life postponed. Julian stood up to leave. His movements were slow and ghostly. He looked at the books on the shelves, thousands of years of human thought, and realized that none of it mattered as much as the tiny glass vial in his pocket. That was the American colony's secret. They hadn't come to Paris to find themselves, they had come to disappear. As he walked back through the dark streets of the left bank, the Eiffel Tower loomed over the city like a giant, iron skeleton. Paris was still the city of light, but for Julian and the lost generation, the only light that mattered was the one that flickered at the end of a silver needle. The secret was safe for now, but the weight of the reality they were fleeing was growing heavier with every passing day, and eventually even the white fairy wouldn't be able to lift it. Shadows in the city of light. The transition from the gilded high to the grey grit did not happen with a bang. It happened with the slow, agonizing drip of an emptying bank account. By the spring of 1925, the illusion of the American aristocrat had shattered for Julian Thorne. The luxury hotels, with their plush carpets, brass elevators, and silver tea service, were now memories that felt like they belonged to another man's life. The city of light was retracting its brilliance, leaving Julian and Clara to wander through the long, cold shadows of its decaying edges. They had been evicted from the Montparnasse studio. The canvases were seized by the landlord. The silver scales of Clara's dresses were sold to a pawnshop on Rue de Rivoli, and the prestige of the Thorne name had become a liability. Now they lived in a decaying garret in the 13th arrondissement, a cramped, freezing room where the wallpaper peeled like sunburnt skin and the air smelled of damp stone and desperation. Julian sat on the edge of a sagging cot. His fingers, once elegant and steady, were now yellowed and trembling. He looked at the single, guttering candle on the crate that served as their table. "How much is left, Julian?" Clara asked from the corner. She was wrapped in a moth-eaten wool coat, her face a pale, sharp triangle in the gloom. 6 francs, Julian whispered. His voice was a dry rattle in his throat. Enough for bread, or enough for a half-file of the lower grade from the docks. There was no hesitation. There was no discussion of food. The hunger in their bellies was nothing compared to the howling, rhythmic scream of their nerves. "The docks then," Clara said. Her eyes were wide, vacant, and haunted. "The bread can wait. The world is too loud without the filter." This was the transition to grit. The heroin craze of the 1920s had moved from the velvet salons of the elite to the dark alleys of the working class. As the supply from Germany and Turkey became more restricted, the white fairy began to change her face. She was no longer a refined medicine. She was a jagged, impure poison cut with chalk and quinine. Julian stood up, feeling the lightheadedness of malnutrition. He walked down the 5 flights of stairs, the wood groaning under his skeletal weight. Outside, the Paris of the postcards was nowhere to be seen. Here, the streets were narrow and slick with refuse. The neon signs were broken, flickering like dying nerves. He made his way toward the Seine, but not the romantic riverbanks where lovers strolled. He went toward the industrial wharves, the place where the shadow merchants gathered. "Hey, American," a voice hissed from a darkened doorway. It was a man known only as the Rat. He was a casualty of the new laws, a former dockworker who now dealt in the scrap ends of the drug trade. He didn't care about Julian's medals or his father's New York law firm. He only cared about the 6 francs. "It's thin today," the Rat muttered, handing over a small, dirty twist of paper. "The police are raiding the pharmacies. The supply is drying up. You're lucky I like Americans." Julian snatched the paper, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't look back. He ran, or rather, stumbled back toward the garret. When he entered the room, Clara was waiting. The air between them was no longer filled with talk of art or the lost generation. They were 2 addicts in a box, bound together by a chemical chain that was tightening every hour. "Did you get it?" she gasped. "Half of what we usually have," Julian said, his hands shaking so violently he could barely open the paper. As they prepared the dose, the shadows in the city of light seemed to lean in closer. There were no silver spoons here, no rosewater, just a bent tin cup and a syringe that had been used so many times the needle was dull and jagged. The high, when it came, was not the gilded high of 1922. It was a heavy, suffocating numbness. It didn't make Julian feel like a genius. It just made him feel like a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet. He looked at Clara, who was slumped against the damp wall, her eyes rolled back. He realized then that they were no longer in Paris. They were in a private hell that looked like a room in the 13th arrondissement. The glamour was gone, the money was gone, the art was a ruined black ink blot on a seized canvas. All that remained was the grit, the raw, shivering reality of 2 people who had traded the world for a shadow. "We have to get out of here, Julian," Clara murmured in her sleep, a single tear carving a path through the grime on her cheek. "We have to go back to the light." But Julian knew better. As the candle flickered and died, leaving them in absolute darkness, he realized that for them there was no more light. There was only the needle and the long, cold walk to the docks tomorrow, and the terrifying knowledge that 6 francs would eventually become 0. The city of light had finally turned off the lamps, and in the darkness, the only thing Julien could hear was the sound of his own shallow, rhythmic breathing, the sound of a man drowning on dry land. The first tremor. The bargain with Lucien Vane had bought them a month of artificial peace, but in the early hours of a rain-soaked Tuesday, the peace shattered. It began not with a scream, but with a tremor. Julien Thorne lay on the damp mattress of their garret. His body, once a temple of American athletic youth, now felt like a house made of dry, splintering wood. The white fairy had vanished, leaving behind a void that was filled with a cold, rhythmic pulsing. This was the first tremor, the physiological debt collector coming to claim the principal and the interest of a year's worth of ecstasy. Julien tried to lift his hand, but his fingers moved with a life of their own. They twitched in a frantic staccato dance, a silent telegraphy of pain. Beside him, Clara was curled into a tight, fetal ball. The silver flapper was gone. In her place was a shivering ghost who whimpered into the moth-eaten wool of her coat. The room was freezing, yet Julien was drenched in a sweat that smelled of chemicals and old fear. "Julien," Clara gasped. Her voice was a thin, broken wire. "The vial, is it truly empty?" Julien didn't have to look. He knew. He had scraped the glass with a needle until his hands bled, seeking a single, microscopic grain of the powder Vane had provided. Empty, Clara, as empty as the sky. The horror of withdrawal in 1920s Paris was a lonely, hidden thing. There were no rehab centers or support groups. There were only the cold stone walls of the 13th arrondissement and the terrifying knowledge that your own blood had turned against you. For Julien, the tremors were accompanied by a sensory distortion. The ghost of the Great War had returned with a vengeance. The sound of the rain against the skylight didn't sound like rain anymore. To his drug-starved brain, it sounded like the rhythmic tapping of a machine gun. Every flash of lightning was the flare of a mortar over the trenches. "I can't breathe, Julien," Clara cried out, her body suddenly arching in a violent spasm. "The air, it feels like sand. Everything is too loud. Why is everything so loud?" This was the hypersensitivity of the crash. The world, which the heroine had so elegantly softened, was now rushing back in with the force of a tidal wave. The ticking of their small clock sounded like an axe hitting a tree. The smell of the damp wallpaper was nauseating. Julien felt as if his skin had been stripped away, leaving every nerve ending exposed to the freezing air. He forced himself to stand. His legs were made of water and glass. He stumbled toward the crate, his eyes searching for anything, a drop of gin, a scrap of the brown paper from Vaugrenard's shop. Nothing. "We have to go to Vane," Julien whispered. His teeth were chattering so loudly it was hard to speak. He said the introductions must be finished first, Clara reminded him through gritted teeth. "He won't give us more until you bring him the ambassador's son." Julien slumped against the wall. The price of the merchant of dreams was now clear. He was no longer just an addict. He was a procurer. To stop the tremors, he would have to lead others into the same lightless room. The moral weight of the choice felt like a physical pressure on his chest, but the addiction, the white hunger, was a god that demanded sacrifice. "I can't do it, Clara," Julien sobbed. The tears were hot and stinging against his cold skin. "I can't bring him here. I can't let him do to them what he's done to us." "Then we die, Julien," Clara screamed, a raw animal sound that tore through the thin walls of the garret. "Look at me, I am disappearing. If the tremors don't stop, my heart will stop." She was right. In the 1920s, many craze victims died during these first tremors, not from the drug itself, but from the sheer, violent shock of the body trying to remember how to live without it. Julien looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He saw a traitor. He saw a soldier who had survived the Germans only to be defeated by a silver needle. He saw the lost generation in its final, pathetic form. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the rain, a heavy, rhythmic knocking on the door below. Thud, thud, thud. Julien froze. Was it the police? Was it Vaugrenard? Or was it Vane's silent enforcer coming to collect the names Julian had promised? The tremors intensified. Julian's hand flew to his throat, feeling the pulse there, fast, weak, and desperate. He looked at Clara, who was now staring at the door with a mixture of terror and hope. In that moment, the first tremor reached its peak. The room seemed to tilt, the walls began to bleed shadows, and the silence of Paris felt like a shroud being pulled over their heads. The White Fairy had invited them to the dance. The Merchant of Dreams had provided the music, but now the music had stopped. And in the cold, shivering dawn of the 13th arrondissement, Julian Thorne realized that the dance was over. The only thing left was the tremor and the long, dark descent that followed. The first tremor. The bargain with Lucien Vane had bought them a month of artificial peace, but in the early hours of a rain-soaked Tuesday, the peace shattered. It began not with a scream, but with a tremor. Julian Thorne lay on the damp mattress of their garret. His body, once a temple of American athletic youth, now felt like a house made of dry, splintering wood. The White Fairy had vanished, leaving behind a void that was filled with a cold, rhythmic pulsing. This was the first tremor, the physiological debt collector coming to claim the principal and the interest of a year's worth of ecstasy. Julian tried to lift his hand, but his fingers moved with a life of their own. They twitched in a frantic staccato dance, a silent telegraphy of pain. Beside him, Clara was curled into a tight, fetal ball. The silver flapper was gone. In her place was a shivering ghost who whimpered into the moth-eaten wool of her coat. The room was freezing, yet Julian was drenched in a sweat that smelled of chemicals and old fear. "Julian," Clara gasped. Her voice was a thin, broken wire. "The vial, is it truly empty?" Julian didn't have to look. He knew. He had scraped the glass with a needle until his hands bled, seeking a single, microscopic grain of the powder Vane had provided. Empty, Clara, as empty as the sky. The horror of withdrawal in 1920s Paris was a lonely, hidden thing. There were no rehab centers or support groups. There were only the cold stone walls of the 13th arrondissement and the terrifying knowledge that your own blood had turned against you. For Julian, the tremors were accompanied by a sensory distortion. The ghost of the Great War had returned with a vengeance. The sound of the rain against the skylight didn't sound like rain anymore. To his drug-starved brain, it sounded like the rhythmic tapping of a machine gun. Every flash of lightning was the flare of a mortar over the trenches. "I can't breathe, Julian," Clara cried out, her body suddenly arching in a violent spasm. "The air, it feels like sand. Everything is too loud. Why is everything so loud?" This was the hypersensitivity of the crash. The world, which the heroine had so elegantly softened, was now rushing back in with the force of a tidal wave. The ticking of their small clock sounded like an axe hitting a tree. The smell of the damp wallpaper was nauseating. Julian felt as if his skin had been stripped away, leaving every nerve ending exposed to the freezing air. He forced himself to stand. His legs were made of water and glass. He stumbled toward the crate, his eyes searching for anything, a drop of gin, a scrap of the brown paper from Vaugrenard's shop. Nothing. "We have to go to Vane," Julian whispered. His teeth were chattering so loudly it was hard to speak. He said the introductions must be finished first, Clara reminded him through gritted teeth. "He won't give us more until you bring him the ambassador's son." Julian slumped against the wall. The price of the Merchant of Dreams was now clear. He was no longer just an addict. He was a procurer. To stop the tremors, he would have to lead others into the same lightless room. The moral weight of the choice felt like a physical pressure on his chest, but the addiction, the white hunger, was a god that demanded sacrifice. "I can't do it, Clara," Julian sobbed. The tears were hot and stinging against his cold skin. "I can't bring him here. I can't let him do to them what he's done to us." "Then we die, Julian," Clara screamed, a raw animal sound that tore through the thin walls of the garret. "Look at me, I am disappearing. If the tremors don't stop, my heart will stop." She was right. In the 1920s, many craze victims died during these first tremors, not from the drug itself, but from the sheer, violent shock of the body trying to remember how to live without it. Julian looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He saw a traitor, He saw a soldier who had survived the Germans only to be defeated by a silver needle. He saw the lost generation in its final, pathetic form. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the rain, a heavy, rhythmic knocking on the door below. Thud, thud, thud. Julian froze. Was it the police? Was it Vaugrenard? Or was it Vane's silent enforcer coming to collect the names Julian had promised? The tremors intensified. Julian's hand flew to his throat, feeling the pulse there, fast, weak, and desperate. He looked at Clara, who was now staring at the door with a mixture of terror and hope. In that moment, the first tremor reached its peak. The room seemed to tilt, the walls began to bleed shadows, and the silence of Paris felt like a shroud being pulled over their heads. The White Fairy had invited them to the dance. The Merchant of Dreams had provided the music, but now the music had stopped. And in the cold, shivering dawn of the 13th arrondissement, Julian Thorne realized that the dance was over. The only thing left was the tremor and the long, dark descent that followed. The streets of no return. The death of André had acted as a final, jagged crack in the porcelain mask of Julian's life. By the late winter of 1925, the City of Light had become a labyrinth of gray shadows and wet cobblestones that led nowhere. Julian Thorne, the once proud American officer, the son of Manhattan wealth, was now a creature of the low places. He had passed the point of grit. He had entered the streets of no return, where the name of the drug was no longer a secret whispered in salons, but a hunger that barked in the belly of the slums. Julian walked along the Quai d'Austerlitz, near the industrial heart of the Seine. The air here was a poisonous soup of coal smoke, rotting timber, and the cold, metallic breath of the river. He was alone. Clara had retreated into a catatonic silence in their garret, her mind unable to process the blue, lifeless face of their friend. Looking for a cure, American, a voice croaked from beneath a rusted iron bridge. Julian stopped. His coat was thin, his boots were cracked, and his eyes were hollow pits of desperation. He looked at the speaker, a man who was less a human and more a collection of rags and sores. This was the Court of Miracles of the 1920s, a gathering of those whom the heroin craze had chewed up and spat out into the mud. "I'm looking for Lucien Vane's men," Julian said. His voice was a dry, brittle rasp. The beggar laughed, a wet, rattling sound that turned into a cough. Vane doesn't send his men down here. Vane stays in his hotel with his silk and his clear gin. Down here, we only have the rats. And the rats don't sell dreams, they sell delay." Julian felt the white hunger beginning to twist his stomach. It was a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. He had no more names to give Vane. He had no more friends to betray. He was a spent bullet. He moved deeper into the district of warehouses. Here, the lost generation was not composed of writers or artists, but of ghosts. He saw a woman in a tattered evening dress, perhaps a duchess once, or a shopgirl with dreams of stardom, huddled over a small tin flame. She was cooking a black, tar-like substance that smelled of burnt vinegar. "The fairy has turned black down here, hasn't she?" the woman muttered as Julian passed. This was the terrifying evolution of the craze. When the pure grade vanished, the streets filled the void with the black tar, a crude, toxic imitation that rotted the veins and blackened the soul. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He realized that the refined medicine of the Rue Noire had been a gateway to this stinking, lightless hell. Suddenly, a group of men emerged from the shadows of a coal barge. They were not addicts. They were the enforcers, the bottom feeders of the criminal hierarchy that Lucien Vane sat atop. "Thorne," the leader said, a man with a scarred lip and eyes like cold flint. "Vane says your account is overdue. You haven't brought any new clients to the hotel. The merchant is disappointed." "I have no more names," Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the wharf. "The people I knew are dead, or they are hiding. I won't lead more sheep to the slaughter." The leader stepped forward, his hand resting on a heavy lead pipe. "Vane doesn't like the word no. He says if you can't be a salesman, you can be an example." The beating was short, brutal, and rhythmic. Every strike of the pipe felt like the artillery shells of the Argonne, dull, heavy, and soul-crushing. Julian lay in the mud, his blood mixing with the oily water of the Seine. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he saw the Eiffel Tower in the distance, a skeletal finger pointing at a god who had long since abandoned Paris. "This is the end of the street, American," the man hissed, kicking Julian one last time. "No more fairy, no more dreams, just the mud." Julian lay there for hours. The streets of no return had finally claimed him. He was no longer a soldier or a poet. He was just a body in the dark. But in that absolute nadir of his existence, a small, cold spark of clarity flickered to life. He realized that Lucien Vane was not a god. Vane was a parasite, and the only way to kill a parasite was to destroy the host or to find a way to bleed it dry. He forced himself to crawl. Every movement was a symphony of pain, every breath was a battle. He pulled himself toward the lights of the city, away from the river and the court of miracles. "I'm coming for you, Vane," Julian whispered, a red foam bubbling at his lips. "I'm coming back from the dead." As the morning sun began to gray the sky over the Seine, Julian Thorne left the streets of no return. He was broken, bleeding, and drug-starved, but for the first time in 3 years, the ghost of the Great War was silent. He had a new war now, a war of one, and the City of Light was about to witness the final, desperate struggle of a man who had nothing left to lose. The craze had taken his life, his love, and his art, but it had forgotten to take his rage. Here is the comprehensive, long-form narrative for Chapter XIII, The Streets of No Return. To reach the depth and word count intensity required for a 30,000-word novel, this chapter focuses on the sensory decay of the Parisian underworld. I have used bolded punctuation and double dashes to create a rhythmic, labored breathing pattern for your voice generator. The Streets of No Return. The death of André had acted as the final, jagged crack in the porcelain mask of Julian's life. By the late winter of 1925, the City of Light had been replaced by a sprawling, damp labyrinth of grey shadows and wet cobblestones that led toward a singular, inevitable destination. Julian Thorne, the once proud American officer, the son of Manhattan privilege, was no longer a citizen of the cafes or the salons. He had passed the point of grit. He had entered the streets of no return. This was the place where the name of the drug was no longer a secret whispered behind velvet curtains. It was a hunger that barked in the bellies of the discarded. Julian walked along the Quai d'Austerlitz, near the industrial, coal-stained heart of the Seine. The air here was a poisonous soup, a mixture of sulfurous coal smoke, rotting timber, and the cold, metallic breath of the river. He was alone. Clara had retreated into a catatonic, shivering silence in their garret, her mind finally broken by the blue, lifeless face of their friend in Montmartre. Julian's mission tonight was not one of art or love. It was the raw, primal hunt for a delay. "Looking for a cure, American," a voice croaked from beneath a rusted iron bridge. Julian stopped. His coat was thin and stained, his boots were cracked, and his eyes were hollow pits of absolute desperation. He looked at the speaker, a man who was less a human and more a collection of rags, sores, and shivering limbs. This was the Court of Miracles of the 1920s, a gathering of those whom the heroin craze had chewed up and spat out into the mud. "I am looking for Lucien Vane's men," Julian said. His voice was a dry, brittle rasp that felt like sand in his throat. The beggar laughed, a wet, rattling sound that quickly dissolved into a racking cough. "Vane doesn't send his silk-clad men down here, boy. Vane stays in his hotel with his clear gin and his heated rooms. Down here, we only have the rats, and the rats don't sell dreams. They only sell a few more minutes of not feeling the world." Julian felt the white hunger beginning to twist his stomach into a knot of fire. It was a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. He had no more names to give Vane. He had no more friends left to betray. He was a spent bullet, a hollow shell of a man who had traded his uniform for a needle. He moved deeper into the district of the warehouses. Here, the lost generation was not composed of writers or painters, but of ghosts. He saw a woman in a tattered evening dress, perhaps a duchess once, or a shopgirl who had dreamed of the stage, huddled over a small, flickering tin flame. She was cooking a black, tar-like substance that smelled of burnt vinegar and old death. The fairy has turned black down here, hasn't she? The woman muttered as Julian passed. This was the terrifying evolution of the craze. When the pure grade from the pharmacies vanished, the streets filled the void with the black tar, a crude, toxic imitation that rotted the veins and blackened the soul. Julian felt a wave of cold nausea. He realized that the refined medicine of the Rue Noire had been nothing more than a gateway to this stinking, lightless hell. Suddenly, 3 men emerged from the shadows of a coal barge. They were not addicts. They were the enforcers, the bottom feeders of the criminal hierarchy that Lucien Vane sat atop. Thorne, the leader said, a man with a scarred lip and eyes like cold flint. Vane says your account is overdue. You haven't brought any new clients to the hotel. The merchant is disappointed in your salesmanship. I have no more names, Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the wharf. The people I knew are dead, or they are hiding. I won't lead more sheep to the slaughter just to stop my hands from shaking. The leader stepped forward, his hand resting on a heavy, lead-weighted pipe. Vane doesn't like the word no, American. He says if you can't be a salesman, you can be an example. The beating was short, brutal, and rhythmic. Every strike of the pipe felt like the artillery shells of the Argonne, dull, heavy, and soul-crushing. Julian lay in the freezing mud, his blood mixing with the oily, black water of the Seine. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he saw the Eiffel Tower in the far distance, a skeletal iron finger pointing at a god who had long since abandoned the streets of Paris. This is the end of the street, American, the man hissed, kicking Julian one last time in the ribs. No more fairy, no more dreams, just the mud. Welcome home. Julian lay there for hours. The streets of no return had finally claimed him. He was no longer a soldier, a son, or a poet. He was just a body in the dark. But in that absolute nadir, in that moment of total ruin, a small, cold spark of clarity flickered to life in the back of his mind. He realized that Lucien Vane was not a god. Vane was a parasite, and the only way to kill a parasite was to either destroy the host or to find a way to bleed the parasite dry. He forced himself to crawl. Every movement was a symphony of agony, every breath was a battle against the cold. He pulled himself toward the distant lights of the city, away from the river and the court of miracles. I'm coming for you, Vane, Julian whispered, a red foam bubbling at his lips. I'm coming back from the dead. As the morning sun began to gray the sky over the Seine, Julian Thorne left the wharves. He was broken, bleeding, and drug-starved, but for the first time in 3 years, the ghost of the Great War was silent. He had a new war now, a war of one, and the City of Light was about to witness the final, desperate struggle of a man who had nothing left to lose but his life. The craze had taken his art, his money, and his love, but it had forgotten to take his rage. Clara's descent. If Julian's journey was a descent into the mud of the Seine, Clara's was a slow, agonizing evaporation of the self. By the time the frost of 1925 began to melt into a gray, weeping spring, the woman who had once been the muse of Montparnasse was gone. She had not died, not yet, but she had been replaced by a phantom that inhabited her skin. The silver scales of her party dresses were long gone. The canvases that once held her electric visions were bare, and the identity she had spent a lifetime building was being systematically traded away, grain by grain, needle by needle, until there was nothing left but the hunger. Julian returned to the garret in the 13th arrondissement, his body a map of bruises and dried blood. He pushed the door open, expecting to find her waiting in the shadows. Instead, he found a room that was even more hollow than the one he had left. "Clara," he whispered. His voice was a broken instrument. The room was silent, but it was the silence of a tomb that had been robbed. The small, ornate vanity table, the one piece of furniture she had insisted on keeping because it belonged to her grandmother in Lyon, was gone. The lace curtains were gone. Even the heavy wool coat she had huddled under for warmth was missing from its hook. He found her in the corner, sitting on the bare floorboards. She was wearing only a thin, stained slip. Her hair, once a sharp, stylish bob, was a tangled nest of charcoal and grease. She was staring at her hands, empty, trembling hands that no longer knew how to hold a brush. I sold it, Julian, she said. Her voice was a flat, glassy monotone that chilled him more than the draft from the window. I sold the vanity. I sold the coat. I even sold the last of my brushes to a student in the Latin Quarter. Clara, the coat. It's freezing outside, Julian gasped, moving toward her. I didn't need the warmth, she replied, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were no longer the vibrant, searching eyes of an artist. They were two dark, bottomless wells of shadow. The white fairy provides her own heat, but she is a demanding guest, Julian. She wanted the vanity. She wanted the memories. She wants everything. This was the heartbreak of Clara's descent. In the 1920s, the heroin craze was often romanticized as a bohemian rebellion, but for women like Clara, it was a trap that stripped away every layer of their agency. She had sold her past to pay for a few more hours of a borrowed future. She had traded the very tools of her soul, her brushes and her paints, to keep the first tremor at bay. We have to stop, Clara, Julian said, sinking to his knees beside her. He reached out to touch her arm, but she flinched away as if his skin were made of fire. Stop, she laughed, a high, brittle sound that bordered on madness. How do you stop the tide, Julian? How do you tell the sun not to rise? I am not Clara anymore. I am just a vessel for the needle. When the needle is full, I exist. When it is empty, I am a ghost. She stood up, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. She walked to the window and looked out at the city of light. I remember the first night at Le Dome, she whispered. I remember the silver dress. I remember thinking that we were the ones who would change the world. We thought we were so clever, didn't we? We thought we found a shortcut to God. She turned back to him, and for a fleeting second, the vanishing muse flickered back into existence. But God wasn't at the end of the needle, Julian. Only Lucien Vane was there, and he doesn't want our art. He wants our disappearance. She reached into the hidden pocket of her slip and pulled out a single, crumpled franc note. This is it, the last of the vanity, the last of my grandmother, the last of me. Julian watched in silent horror as she began to prepare what she called her final portrait. She wasn't painting on a canvas. She was preparing a dose that was far too large for her fragile skeletal frame. The white hunger had reached its endgame. She wasn't looking for a high anymore. She was looking for an exit. Don't do it, Clara, Julian pleaded, his voice thick with tears. I found a way. I'm going to take down Vane. We can leave Paris. We can go back to the coast. Paris never lets you go, Julian, she said softly, her eyes fixing on the silver syringe. And the fairy, she doesn't want us to leave. She wants us to stay here in the dark forever. As the needle entered her vein, Clara's face underwent a terrifying transformation. For a moment, the tension left her jaw. The shivering stopped. A soft, artificial glow seemed to radiate from her skin. She looked, for one final heartbeat of time, like the girl in the silver dress again. It's beautiful, Julian, she whispered, her head falling back against the damp wall. The light, it's finally coming back. But Julian knew the truth. The light she was seeing was the flickering candle of a life being extinguished. He held her as she drifted away, her breathing becoming shallow and rhythmic, a slow, fadding beat that matched the ticking of the clock they no longer owned. Clara had finished her descent. She had sold her last belongings. She had surrendered her last shred of identity. And as the moon rose over the 13th arrondissement, Julian Thorne sat in the hollow room, cradling the ghost of the woman he loved, realizing that in the city of light, the darkness was now absolute. The descent was over. The tragedy had found its home. The fog over the Seine was not merely a weather condition. It was a physical weight, a damp shroud that clung to the stone arches of the bridges as if trying to hide the sins of the city below. Julian Thorne stood at the edge of the Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in Paris, watching the black water swirl beneath him. This was the bridge of sighs for the lost generation. Behind him lay the ruins of his life, the empty garrets, the blue face of André, and the ghost of Clara. In front of him, hidden in the grey veil of the night, was the man who had architected it all, Lucien Vane. The law was indeed awake. He could hear the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens from the direction of the Gare de l'Est. The police were closing the net, but Julian knew that Vane was like smoke. Unless you grabbed him now, he would vanish into the underground of Europe, only to resurface in Berlin or London with a new name and a new bag of dreams. Julian's hand moved to the pocket of his tattered coat. He felt the cold, hard weight of a pistol, a relic from the Great War that he had kept hidden beneath floorboards. His fingers were trembling, but not from the white hunger this time. It was the adrenaline of the hunt. "You look like a man waiting for a ferry that will never arrive," a voice whispered from the fog. Julian spun around, the pistol half drawn. Emerging from the mist was not a monster, but a vision of elegance. Lucien Vane was leaning against a stone pillar, a silver cigarette case in his hand. Even as a fugitive, he looked untouched by the grit of the streets. His overcoat was pristine, his eyes were as cold and clear as the gin he favored. "Vane," Julian spat. The name felt like a piece of shrapnel in his throat. "I expected you to be in a cell by now, Julian," Vane said, his voice calm, almost melodic. "Or perhaps in a morgue beside your charming Clara. I hear she took the long sleep. A pity. She had such a delicate way of holding a needle." "You killed her," Julian hissed, stepping forward. "You killed all of us. You turned our trauma into a ledger of profit." Vane laughed, a soft, rhythmic sound that was drowned out by the distant sirens. "I provided a service, Thorne. I didn't pull the trigger, I just sold the bullets. You Americans came to Paris seeking an escape from yourselves. I simply gave you a map to the exit. Don't blame the merchant for the buyer's hunger." Julian raised the pistol, the barrel shaking. At that moment, the bridge of sighs became a crossroads of the soul. He could pull the trigger and finish the war. He could kill the man who had destroyed his generation. But he also heard the boots of the police on the cobblestones. If he fired, he was dead. If he waited, the law would take Vane, but the merchant would use his wealth to buy a way out. "Do it, Julian," Vane whispered, his eyes narrowing with a predatory curiosity. "Be the soldier one last time. Show me that all those medals were worth something more than the silver they were melted into." The silence on the bridge was absolute, broken only by the lapping of the water against the stone. Julian looked at the man who represented the heroin craze, the charisma, the cruelty, and the absolute lack of remorse. He thought of Clara's last belongings. He thought of the streets of no return. Suddenly, Julian lowered the gun. A strange, cold smile touched his lips. "No," Julian said. His voice was now as steady as a rock. "The police are 2 minutes away, Vane. They don't just want you for the drugs. I've spent the last 3 hours at the prefecture. I gave them your ledgers. I gave them the names of your suppliers in Basel. I gave them your bank accounts in Zurich." Vane's composure finally flickered. For the first time, the merchant of dreams looked like a man who was waking up to a nightmare. "You're a fool," Vane hissed, his hand moving toward his own pocket. "You'll go down with me." "I was already down, Vane," Julian said, as the first blue lights of the police vans reflected off the fog. "I'm just here to make sure you don't find the exit." As the law closed in, Julian Thorne stepped back into the shadows of the bridge. The craze was over, the hunt was finished, and as he watched the police tackle the merchant of dreams into the mud, Julian realized that his own descent had finally ended. He was broken, he was an addict, and he was alone, but for the first time since 1918, he was no longer a ghost. The sanitarium walls. The world did not end with a gunshot or a leap into the Seine. It ended with the cold, sterile click of a heavy iron door. Julian Thorne found himself no longer in the velvet embrace of a salon, nor in the damp shadows of a Montmartre garret. He was inside the sanitarium of Saint-Anne, a place where the French state sent those whom the White Fairy had rendered unfit for society. Here, the walls were not covered in art. They were painted a pale, sickly green that seemed to absorb the light. This was the beginning of the brutal detox, the long, excruciating war between Julian's spirit and his chemical master. Julian lay strapped to a narrow iron bed. The leather restraints around his wrists and ankles were a necessary cruelty. The first tremor had evolved into something far more monstrous. His body was a landscape of fire and ice. Every nerve ending was screaming for the poison that had been its only fuel for years. "Patience, Monsieur Thorne," a doctor said, his voice as cold as the tile floor. He stood at the foot of the bed, holding a clipboard. "No silver trays here, no elegant vials, just the smell of carbolic acid and the sound of distant, muffled screams from the other wards. "You are not a patient here," the doctor continued. "You are a prisoner of your own blood. We do not provide a cure. We only provide a cage while your body learns to stop begging for its own destruction." The days and nights bled into one another, a rhythmic cycle of agony. Without the drug, the ghost of the Great War returned with terrifying clarity. Julian wasn't in a Paris hospital. He was back in the mud of the Argonne. He could feel the gas burning his lungs. He could see the faces of the boys who had stayed behind. But now, the faces were mixed with those of the lost generation. He saw André, his skin a permanent, haunting blue. He saw Clara, her hand reaching out to him from the fog of the Pont Neuf. "Clara," he would gasp, his throat feeling like it was filled with broken glass. But there was no Clara. There was only the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water from a leaky pipe in the corner. The sanitarium was a factory of silence. In the 1920s, the treatment for heroin addiction was primitive and brutal. They didn't have the medicines of the future. They only had isolation, cold baths, and the terrifying philosophy of cold turkey. Julian had to face the monster alone. He lost the ability to distinguish between dreams and reality. He saw Lucien Vane standing in the corner of his cell, offering him a glass of clear gin and a silver needle. Vane would smile, that polished, predatory smile, and whisper, "Just one introduction, Julian, just one more name, and the walls will disappear." Julian would thrash against his restraints, screaming until his voice was gone. "I have no more names, I have no more soul." The sanitarium walls were more than stone and mortar. They were the boundaries of his own sanity. Every hour was a battle. He had to decide, over and over again, if he wanted to live. The drug had taken his art, his money, and the woman he loved. If he surrendered now, the White Fairy would win the final victory. "I am still here," Julian whispered to the empty, green-walled room. He said it until the words became a mantra, a rhythmic shield against the darkness. "I am Julian Thorne. I am a soldier. I am not a ghost." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the tremors began to fade. The fire in his veins turned into a dull ache. The faces of the dead retreated into the shadows. One morning, the sun broke through the high, barred window, casting a single golden bar across the floor. For the first time in years, the light didn't hurt his eyes. It felt real. The doctor entered, looking surprised to find Julian sitting up, his eyes clear and focused. "You have survived the peak, monsieur," the doctor noted, though his voice remained clinical. "But do not be fooled. The fairy is patient. She will wait for you at every street corner in Paris. She will whisper to you in every glass of wine. The walls of this sanitarium are easy to leave. The walls of your memory are not." Julian looked at his hands. They were thin, but they were steady. He felt a profound, hollow sadness, a grief for the years he had lost and the people he had failed. But beneath the grief, there was a new, hard layer of granite. He was clean, he was broken, but he was alive. As the guards unlocked the iron door to allow him into the courtyard for his first hour of exercise, Julian Thorne looked at the grey sky of Paris. He was ready to leave the sanitarium, but he knew the war wasn't over. He had to find what was left of Clara. He had to find if anything remained of the City of Light after the craze had burned it to the ground. The sanitarium walls had held him while he broke. Now, they would release him to see if he could truly stand. The sanitarium walls. The world did not end with a dramatic flourish or a final leap into the black waters of the Seine. It ended with the hollow, metallic clack of a heavy iron bolt sliding into place. Julian Thorne found himself no longer in the velvet-draped sanctuary of a Montparnasse salon, nor in the damp, lightless shadows of a 13th arrondissement garret. He was inside the sanitarium of Saint-Anne, a sprawling grey fortress on the outskirts of Paris, where the French state sent those whom the White Fairy had rendered unfit for the eyes of the living. Here, the walls were not covered in the electric visions of the avant-garde. They were painted a pale, sickly, institutional green that seemed to actively absorb the light of the sun. This was the beginning of the brutal detox, the long, excruciating, and lonely war between Julian's shattered spirit and the chemical master that had owned his blood for 3 years. Julian lay strapped to a narrow iron bed that creaked with every shallow breath he took. The leather restraints around his wrists and ankles were a necessary cruelty, for when the white hunger was denied, the human body became a frantic, self-destructing animal. The first tremor had long since passed, replaced now by a monstrous, full-body vibration that felt as though his very bones were trying to vibrate out of his skin. "Patience, Monsieur Thorne," a doctor said. His voice was as cold and sterile as the white tile floor. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed, a silhouette against the harsh glare of an electric bulb. He did not offer a silver tray, he did not offer a refined vial of German sedative. He only held a clipboard and a heavy pocket watch. In this ward, the air did not smell of expensive Turkish tobacco or jasmine perfume. It smelled of carbolic acid, unwashed skin, and the distant, muffled screams of men who were losing their minds in the adjoining cells. "You are not a patient here," the doctor continued. "You are a prisoner of your own neurology. We do not provide a cure at Saint Tan. We only provide a cage where your body must learn the hard lesson of how to survive without its poison." The days and nights bled into a singular, rhythmic cycle of agony. Without the drug to act as a filter, the ghost of the Great War returned with a sensory violence Julian had never imagined possible. He was no longer in a Paris sanitarium. He was back in the mud of the Argonne forest. He could feel the gas burning his lungs. He could hear the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the heavy artillery. But now, the ghosts were wearing the faces of the jazz age. He saw André, his skin a permanent, haunting shade of blue. He saw the merchant, Lucien Vane, laughing as he counted out silver vials like 30 pieces of silver, and most painfully, he saw Clara. Clara, he would gasp. His throat felt as if it were lined with rusted razor blades. But there was no Clara. There was only the rhythmic drip-drip-drip of a leaky radiator in the corner. In the 1920s, the treatment for addiction was primitive, a brutal philosophy of cold turkey that bordered on the medieval. There were no soothing balms, no gradual tapers. There was only the ice bath, where they plunged his shivering, feverish body into tubs of freezing water to shock his nervous system into submission. "Kill me," Julian would scream, his voice breaking into a raw, animal howl. "Just kill me and let the war be over." "The war is over, Monsieur Thorne," a nurse would whisper as she cinched his restraints tighter. "This is the peace you chose. Now you must learn to live in it." The sanitarium walls became a psychological mirror. Every crack in the plaster was a memory, every shadow was a missed opportunity. He spent hours watching the dust motes dance in a single barred shaft of moonlight, the same dust motes he and Clara had once mistaken for liquid gold. He realized then that the gilded high was a debt that was now being collected with interest. The drug hadn't given them anything. It had merely borrowed happiness from the future and spent it all in a single, frantic night in 1922. During the second week, the hallucinations took a darker turn. He saw Lucien Vane standing in the corner of the cell, dressed in his pristine midnight blue suit. Vane held a silver syringe, the liquid inside glowing with an unearthly, beckoning light. "Why suffer, Julian?" the hallucination would whisper in a smooth, melodic baritone. "Just one name, one more American socialite, one more son of a diplomat. I can make these walls disappear. I can make the tremors stop. I can bring Clara back to life." Julian would thrash against the iron bed, his eyes squeezed shut. "You aren't real, you're the merchant of lies." "I am the only reality you have left," the ghost of Vane would reply. "The rest is just green paint and iron bars." But on the 14th night, something shifted. The white hunger began to lose its jagged edge. The rhythmic pulsing in his veins subsided into a dull, manageable ache. The sanitarium walls no longer felt like they were closing in. They felt like they were holding him together. Julian Thorne began to remember the man he was before the war, the man who loved the smell of the sea, the man who believed in the power of the written word. He was Julian Thorne. He was 30 years old. He was a survivor of the Argonne, and he would be a survivor of Paris. One morning, the sun broke through the high window with a clarity that made him weep. It wasn't the drug-induced light of the fairy. It was the hard, honest light of a world that didn't care if he lived or died. And that indifference was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The doctor entered, looking down at Julian with a flicker of genuine surprise. "The tremors have stopped. Your pulse is steady. You have survived the peak, monsieur." "I want to leave," Julian said. His voice was weak, but it carried a new, hard layer of granite. "You may leave the building," the doctor warned, "but remember, the White Fairy is a patient hunter. She will wait for you in the shadow of every bistro. She will whisper to you every time you smell the rain on the cobblestones. The walls of Saint-Anne are easy to escape, the walls of your own memory. Those you will carry forever." Julian looked at his hands. They were thin, the skin translucent, but they were finally mercifully still. He was clean, he was broken. He was a man without a country, without a lover, and without a future. But as the guards finally unbolted the iron door to let him into the courtyard, Julian Thorne took his first breath of air that didn't taste of chemicals. The sanitarium walls had broken him down to his very essence. Now he had to see if the man who remained was strong enough to walk the streets of Paris without falling into the abyss again. He was going to find Clara, he was going to find the sun. And he was going to find a way to make the merchant of dreams pay for the ghosts he had created. Searching for the sun. The gates of Saint-Anne swung shut behind Julian Thorne with a final echoing clang that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of his bones. He stood on the sidewalk, a tall, gaunt figure in a charcoal overcoat that now hung loosely over his skeletal frame. He was clean. The White Fairy had been purged from his blood with the violence of an exorcism. But as he looked toward the horizon, where the spire of the Eiffel Tower cut through a bruised, lavender sky, he realized that being clean was not the same as being whole. He was a man made of glass, transparent, fragile, and utterly broken. Julian began his long walk back toward the heart of Paris. This was his search for the sun, a desperate quest to find a single spark of warmth in a city that now felt as cold as a mausoleum. The Paris he returned to in the late spring of 1926 was not the same city he had entered in 1922. The années folles, the crazy years, were beginning to lose their luster. The police crackdowns had driven the White Queen deep into the sewers. The jazz in the clubs sounded tired, a frantic repetition of a joy that no longer existed. The American colony was shrinking. Many had fled back to New York. Others had been buried in the potter's fields of Montmartre. Julian's first stop was Le Dôme. He stood outside the glass windows, watching the swirl of smoke and the clatter of saucers. He saw the table where he had first met Clara. A young couple sat there now, a boy with a fresh face and a girl with a bright, bobbed head of hair. They were laughing, drinking vermouth, and looking at the world with the same dangerous arrogance Julian once possessed. He felt like a ghost watching the living perform a play he had already finished. "Monsieur Thorne." He turned. It was the waiter, Jean, a man whose face was a map of Parisian cynicism. Jean looked at Julian's hollow cheeks and steady hands, and for the first time, the waiter's eyes softened. "You have been away, monsieur," Jean said softly. "The sanitarium, it has left its mark on you." "I am looking for Clara," Julian said. His voice was low, stripped of its former Harvard polish. "Has she been here, Jean? Has she come back to the light?" Jean looked away, wiping a clean cloth over a perfectly clean table. "Mademoiselle Clara, she was here a month ago, but she was not the Clara you remember. She was a shadow, monsieur. She sat in the corner for 4 hours, staring at a blank sketchbook. She didn't order a drink. She only asked if the merchant had been by." The mention of Vane felt like a needle prick to Julian's soul. And has Lucien Vane been seen? "The merchant is a ghost now, monsieur. The police are everywhere. They say he fled to Berlin. Others say he is hiding in the tunnels beneath the Gare de l'Est. But the girl," she went toward the river. Julian left the cafe without a word. He walked through the ghosts of former haunts. He went to the studio in Montmartre, but the door was padlocked, and a for rent sign hung crookedly over the entrance. He went to the pharmacy on Rue Noire, but the green neon cross was dark, the windows boarded up with heavy, splintered timber. The map of his addiction was being erased by the law, but the map of his heart was still bleeding. "Clara," he shouted into the wind as he reached the Pont des Arts. The River Seine flowed beneath him, black and indifferent. He searched the faces of the junkies who still haunted the shadows of the bridges, the ones the police hadn't yet swept away. He saw women who looked like Clara from a distance, but as he approached, he saw only the same pinned pupils and the same grey skin. They were not his Clara, they were merely more casualties of the same war. He realized then that searching for her among their haunts was a mistake. They had haunted those places when they were seeking an escape. If Clara was still alive, if there was any piece of the vanishing muse left, she wouldn't be where the drug was, she would be where the art was. He turned toward the Luxembourg Gardens. It was late afternoon. The sun was finally breaking through the clouds, casting long, golden shadows across the gravel paths. This was where Clara had come in the early days to sketch the children and the sailboats. Julian walked past the Medici fountain, his heart pounding with a rhythmic, fearful hope. And then he saw her. She was sitting on a green metal chair near the pond. She wasn't wearing silver scales or silk. She was wearing a simple, faded blue dress. Her hair was longer, unstyled, and she looked smaller than he remembered, as if the world was slowly pressing the air out of her. She wasn't holding a syringe. She was holding a charcoal pencil. Julian stopped 10 feet away. He was afraid that if he breathed, she would dissolve into the mist. Clara. She didn't move at first. Then very slowly she turned her head. Her face was pale, the shadows under her eyes were permanent bruises, but her eyes, for the first time in years, were focused. They were looking at the sun. "Julian," she whispered, the name was a sigh of recognition. You smell like soap and fresh air." "I'm clean, Clara," he said, stepping closer. "The sanitarium, I survived the walls." "I survived the wharves," she said, looking down at her sketchbook. He saw the page. It wasn't a jagged wound or a black ink blot. It was a simple, shaky sketch of a child's sailboat on the water. It was imperfect, it was trembling, but it was a beginning. They sat together in the fading light, two survivors of a gilded high that had nearly cost them their souls. They didn't embrace, they weren't ready for that kind of weight. They simply sat, side by side, watching the sun set over the city that had broken them. "Is the merchant truly gone?" she asked. "The law has his name, the streets have his shadow. He is a ghost now, Clara, just like us." The search for the sun had ended not with a grand triumph, but with a quiet, shaky sketch in a public garden. They were clean, but they were broken. They were the lost generation who had found themselves at the bottom of a silver needle and had somehow crawled back out. "What do we do now, Julian?" Julian looked at her, then at the city, the beautiful, lethal, indifferent Paris. "We learn to live in the light, Clara, even if it hurts our eyes." As the lanterns of the Luxembourg Gardens began to flicker to life, Julian Thorne took Clara's hand. Her skin was cold, but as the last rays of the sun hit the water, he felt a faint, rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat that belonged to the world of the living. The craze was over, the search was finished. Now the long, slow work of the morning had begun. Requiem for a Dreamer. The year is now 1930. The roaring engine of the 20s has not just slowed down, it has crashed into the cold, hard reality of a new decade. In the United States, the stock market has collapsed, taking with it the dreams of millions. But in Paris, the collapse happened much earlier, not in the banks, but in the veins of a generation. Julian Thorne stands on the deck of a steamer ship, the SS France, watching the coastline of Europe dissolve into a smudge of grey on the horizon. He is finally going home to New York, but he is not the man who left it. This is his requiem for a dreamer, a final prayer for the ghosts of 1920s Paris. Julian leans against the salt-crusted railing. His hands are steady now, though the scars on his arms are permanent maps of his journey through the abyss. He is 34 years old, yet in the reflection of the cabin window, he sees a face that has aged a century. Beside him stands Clara. She is quiet, her eyes fixed on the retreating wake of the ship. She still carries a sketchbook, but now she draws the ocean, vast, clean, and terrifyingly honest. "Do you think they will remember us, Julian?" she asks. Her voice is no longer a ghost's whisper, but it carries a haunting weight. The ones who didn't make it to the ship, the ones who stayed in the streets of no return. Julian looks at the dark Atlantic water. Paris is a city that forgets its own tragedies to make room for its next romance, Clara. We will be remembered as a footnote, a craze that burned bright and turned to ash. They will talk about the jazz and the hemlines, but they will forget the needles and the silence. This is the crushing reality of the lost generation. They were not lost because they couldn't find their way home. They were lost because they found a truth that was too heavy to carry. The heroin craze of the 1920s was not just a medical mishap. It was a spiritual hunger, a collective attempt by a war-torn youth to find a shortcut to God, only to find Lucien Vane waiting at the end. Julien thinks of Lucien Vane, who is now rotting in a French prison, stripped of his silk suits and his circle of dreams. Vane was the merchant of a decade's despair, but as the new world of the 1930s rises, filled with bread lines and political iron, the White Fairy seems like a primitive monster compared to the darkness approaching Europe. "We are the survivors of a beautiful plague," Julien murmurs to the wind. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, tarnished silver flask. It is the same flask he carried into the Gare du Nord 4 years ago. It is empty now. He doesn't need the gin, and he certainly doesn't need the filter. He looks at it for a moment, then tosses it over the side. He watches it hit the water with a tiny splash, swallowed instantly by the vast, indifferent ocean. The requiem is not just for the dead. It is for the parts of themselves they left behind. Julien left his youth in the Argonne, he left his innocence in Montparnasse, and he left his arrogance in the sanitarium of Saint-Anne. What remains is a man who knows the value of the morning light, a man who understands that the gilded high was a lie told by a dying century. "Look, Julien," Clara says, pointing ahead. Through the fog of the Atlantic, the first lights of America begin to flicker. It is not the neon orange of Paris. It is a cold, pale white. It is the light of a country in pain, a country that is about to face its own reckoning. But for Julien and Clara, it is a clean slate. They are no longer the muses or the soldiers of the craze. They are merely two people who learned how to breathe again. As the ship nears the harbor, the jazz of the 20s feels like a distant, distorted echo from a dream. The decade of decadence is over. The White Queen has been dethroned. The era of the needle has met its crushing, emotional conclusion. Julien Thorne takes Clara's hand, feeling the rhythmic beat of her pulse against his palm. It is the only music he needs now. The waltz has ended, the lights have gone out, but the dreamers, those who survived the descent, are finally, mercifully waking up. The requiem is finished. The story is closed. And as the sun rises over the Statue of Liberty, Julien Thorne takes his first step into a world where the only fairy he needs is the strength to wake up tomorrow. Requiem for a Dreamer. The year is now 1930. The roaring engine of the 20s has not just slowed down, it has crashed into the cold, unforgiving granite of a new decade. In the United States, the stock market has collapsed like a house of cards, taking with it the reckless optimism of the Gilded Age. But for Julien Thorne, the collapse had happened much earlier, not in the banks of Wall Street, but in the veins of Paris. He stands today on the deck of the SS France, a massive steamer cutting through the iron-gray swells of the Atlantic. He is going home to a New York he barely remembers, but he is not the man who left it. This is his requiem for a dreamer, a final, silent prayer for the ghosts of 1920s Paris, and for the man he used to be before the White Fairy claimed his soul. Julien leans against the salt-crusted railing. His hands are steady now, though the scars on his inner arms remain, a permanent, jagged map of his journey through the abyss. He is 34 years old, yet when he catches his reflection in the spray-flecked cabin window, he sees a face that has aged a century. The sharpness of the war veteran has been replaced by the hollow wisdom of a survivor. Beside him, wrapped in a heavy wool coat against the biting sea wind, stands Clara. She is quiet, her eyes fixed on the retreating wake of the ship, where the horizon of Europe has already dissolved into a smudge of charcoal mist. "Do you think the city misses us, Julien?" she asks. Her voice is no longer the brittle rasp of the garrets, but it carries a haunting, melodic weight. Or do you think Paris simply washes the blood from the cobblestones every morning and waits for the next set of fools? Julien looks at the dark, churning water. Paris is a city that thrives on its own tragedies, Clara. It is a beautiful machine that consumes the young and turns their heartbreak into poetry. We will be remembered as a footnote, a craze that burned with a blinding chemical light and then turned to ash. The history books will talk about the jazz. They will talk about the short skirts and the lost writers, but they will never find the words for the silence that followed the needle. This is the crushing reality of the lost generation. They were not lost because they couldn't find a map. They were lost because they had found a truth that was too heavy for the world to acknowledge. The heroin craze of the 1920s was not merely a medical mishap or a bohemian vice. It was a spiritual hunger. It was a collective attempt by a war-torn youth to find a shortcut to God, only to find the merchant, Lucien Vane, waiting at the end with a silver price tag. Julian thinks of Lucien Vane, who is now a number in a French prison. Stripped of his tailored suits and his circle of dreams, Vane was the architect of their ruin, but as Julian looks toward the western horizon, he realizes that Vane was merely a symptom of a sick world. The White Fairy had been their escape from the memory of the trenches, but she had become a trench of her own, a deep, dark ditch where they had buried their talent, their money, and their friends. "We are the survivors of a gilded plague," Julian murmurs to the wind. He reaches into the inner pocket of his coat and pulls out a small, tarnished silver flask. It is the same flask he had clutched so tightly in the Gare du Nord in 1922. It is empty now. He hasn't touched a drop of gin, nor a grain of the powder, since the day the sanitarium walls released him. He looks at the object, a relic of his former arrogance, and with a sudden, decisive motion, he tosses it over the side of the ship. He watches as it glints once in the cold sunlight, before hitting the water with a tiny, insignificant splash. The Atlantic swallows it instantly. The past is being buried, one silver relic at a time. The requiem is not just for the dead, for André, for the nameless girls of Pigalle, or for the poets who overdosed in the shadows of the Louvre. It is a requiem for the parts of themselves they left behind. Julian left his youth in the mud of the Argonne. He left his innocence in the salons of Montparnasse, and he left his vanity in the green-walled cells of Saint-Anne. What remains is a man who knows the value of a single, sober breath of air. "Look, Julian, the fog is lifting," Clara points ahead. Through the salt spray and the Atlantic mist, the first lights of America begin to flicker on the horizon. It is not the searing neon orange of the Parisian boulevards. It is a cold, pale, and honest white. It is the light of a country in the grip of the Great Depression, a land of bread lines, shattered banks, and hard truths. But for Julian and Clara, it is a clean slate. They are no longer the golden couple of the cafes. They are merely two people who learned how to live in the gray. "What will we do in New York, Julian?" Clara asks, her hand finding his. Her skin is cold, but her grip is firm. "We will do the only thing we can, Clara," Julian replies, looking at the distant skyline of Manhattan. "We will wake up every morning, we will look at the sun without blinking, and we will tell the story. We will tell it so that the next generation knows that the White Fairy doesn't have wings, she only has claws." The 1920s are over. The decadence has met its crushing, emotional conclusion. The waltz at El Olympia has ended, and the lights of Paris have been extinguished by the coming storm of the 30s. But as the ship docks and the rhythmic thrum of the engines finally stops, Julian Thorne takes a long, deep breath. He is clean, he is broken, he is scarred, but for the first time in a decade, he is finally, beautifully home. The requiem is finished. The dreamer has awakened.